here for the Players Coalition Policing the Future event. We've got 3 panels, and we're just going to sort of dig into, we hear so much about tension between our community and the police department, police forces across the country, and so we're going to sort of dig into that and see what the causes of those issues are and what we can do about it moving forward. And so this is our first panel here, being moderated by Anquan Boldin, former NFL Walter Payton Man of the Year, multi-time NFL Pro Bowler and founder of the Players Coalition. We have Aramis Ayala, who is the state's attorney for the 9th District in Florida, represent for Florida. We have Jim Trainum, who is retired, a former 27-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department in New York and a detective. He's now retired, and he's spent the time since his retirement working as an expert talking about primarily issues related to false confession, but just generally police reform issues. And we have Jeffrey Robinson, who is the Deputy Legal Director at the ACLU and Director of the Trone Center for Racial Justice within the ACLU. And we're all going to sit and sort of dig into this issue and the roots of this issue and the sources, the root causes of this issue, and take it from there.
Could I ask a quick question? Do you mind? Is this going to be an open dialogue?
Oh, so yes, I'm sorry. I meant to tell you. Thank you, sir. The way this is going to happen is it's going to be a conversation. About halfway through, we're going to take questions from folks, and and we'll sort of switch to that format before going back.
Well, not only questions, but will the audience have an opportunity to present ideas in regard to how to stop the black killings in this country?
There will be an open discussion. You can ask. We'll have questions that we present to the panelists, and it will be a discussion that way. Yes. Thank you.
Like you said, I'm Anquan Boldin, one of the co-founders of the Players Coalition. Happy that you guys came out to join us because I think this is a very important topic. It's something that we've discussed at length as a coalition. And everybody has a number of different opinions when it comes to policing in African-American communities. So we'll just jump right into it. My first question to you guys is there a problem when it relates to police and low-income communities, African-American communities? And if you think so, what are those problems and why do they exist?
Well, I'll start. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the work that the Players Coalition is doing here. And I guess I will start with something I read in Sports Illustrated about 7 years ago. A young man named Marquise Weeks had run back a kickoff return for a touchdown, about 101 yards in an NCAA game. I think he played for Virginia Tech. And when he was interviewed after the game, he was asked, "How did you do that?" And his response was, "Well, that was just instinct, kind of like running from the cops." And when I read it, I started laughing, and then I stopped laughing because I thought, this is not actually very funny. And I think his comment touched on something that is important when we talk about policing in America, and that is that the history of policing in America, going back to colonial days, has always had as one of its core requirements the control and suppression of black communities. That is simply the history in our country, starting in 1669, when Virginia passed a law saying if a master kills an enslaved person who is resisting, it's not a felony. There is no law like that on the books in any state in the country. But if you want to go back over the last 10 years and look at the number of unarmed black and brown people killed by police, and then compare that to the number of police who are prosecuted, and then compare that to the number of police who are actually convicted, that law may not be on the books, but that reality is still a reality. And I think one of the important things is to understand the police didn't come up with this mission on their own. This is not something where the police said, this is what we want to do. This is what our country asked the police to do and has asked them to do throughout our history. So you can go through numerous points in our history to show why a badge and a gun have represented some of the most terroristic and frightening things possible in the black community in America. That's why what Mr. Weeks said, it's kind of like instinct running from the cops. This goes back generation from generation from generation. And so I think understanding that reality of how police forces were formed, what their initial purpose was, and how that has worked out through our history is important to understanding how we got to this place in 2019, where there is so much of a lack of trust. Last thing I'll say is, please remember, throughout the history of lynchings in America, an average of one black person a week for a century, between 1868 and 1968, you can't lynch someone in the middle of town without the police knowing about it. The Tulsa Massacre in 1921, 300 black people shot, killed, and buried, not one person prosecuted. You can't burn down 35 square blocks of a city and kill 300 people without the police knowing about it. And when you think of separate but equal, and those kind of laws, it was the police that we asked to enforce those laws. It was the police that took Rosa Parks off the bus. So part of the problem with policing is what we have asked the police to do as a country, and I think that's an important place to start.
You know, I think that we can start adding to that conversation. In addition to the historical implications, you're also looking at the media and the images that you deal with black and brown communities. And a lot of times we're perpetuating this concept that they need to be controlled more than protected. When you're looking for the need to control, when you're looking for individuals out of control, you then begin to find individuals out of control. And when you have cultural differences between how they communicate with each other, it's easy to think that an average conversation that is elevated begins to be it's something that begins a process of violence. So they need to step in earlier to control. And when we continue to see the concept of black and brown communities needing to be controlled, it's law enforcement who, from historically, that's their responsibility to do it. Then you also have the timeline of us as a country beginning to balance, at least trying to balance some of the rights, some of the equality, and then every encounter ends up being a power pull. Who has the power here? And then you have individuals, young black men, who are like, I do know my rights, I do have my rights, and then they have that officer who's in blue that's going to remind them who's in control, and it begins to elevate, and ultimately it's that firearm being discharged that shows who's in control.
And really the issue begins with the recruitment process. If you watch recruitment videos for law enforcement, if you see the posters, it's not the detective poring over mounds of paperwork. It's not the officer dealing with somebody in the community who has a social problem, whatever. It's the SWAT teams. It's the drug teams. It's the people that you're repelling out of helicopters. So we're recruiting people who are more action-oriented. We're looking to the military a lot more than I think we should. Now, military service is great, but it doesn't always transfer to the policing of a civilian population. Military is much more into order maintenance, and we have to be much more flexible. It then goes into our training. When we are trained, we're typically trained on the worst-case scenario. We're not trained how to effectively interact with people who are different from us as much as we're trained for self-preservation. Just as an example, I remember being trained in how to do traffic stops. A very simple procedure, that you pull the car over, officer walks up. The first scenario that they ran, though, the officer got shot. So every time after that, everybody's approaching the car with the guns, with their hand on their gun, expecting the worst. And that's what they train us to do. And third is how we're judged. We judge ourselves and we judge our officers based on stats. And those stats are manipulated, they're false, they're numbers. They don't look behind the numbers. Just as an example, if you have a department that says that they have a 97% closure rate in homicides, all that means is that they've either made an arrest or that they were able to close it out on paper because they thought the suspect was dead. The public thinks that, oh my God, that means that we've convicted 97% of the people who were responsible. But we manipulate those numbers because we only look at arrests. We don't count what happens after that. And that's where the community is missing out. We're not looking behind the scenes. We're taking the numbers at face value. So if a community has a spike in crime, we send the drug unit in, and then we can tout to the media that, yeah, we took care of the problem. We made 15, 20 arrests, recovered 20 guns, but we don't look at the underlying facts behind those arrests, and we don't look at the damage that's done because we're just seeking stats.
So, Jim, what do you suggest? Because a lot of your work is based on bad police interrogation techniques.
Yes. Well, it's funny because in this country, we primarily use what is called the accusatory approach. It's a guilt presumptive approach where we're not supposed to use it unless we're convinced that you're guilty, which of course contributes to confirmation bias throughout. But the people who developed and taught this approach, they actually say, well, part of the approach is that we're allowed to lie about evidence. We're allowed to use implied threats and promises of leniency. And they say that they admit that these techniques in any normal social setting would be considered unethical. But as they say in their textbooks, because we are dealing with people on a lower moral plane, we're allowed to use those. Now, in the UK, it is totally different. They're not allowed to use any of the techniques that we typically use in this country. And in fact, they're considered to be human rights violations. And what they emphasize is by treating the person with respect, by treating them fairly, one, you're going to get more information, but two, you know, let's say today's suspect is tomorrow's witness. If you treat people fairly, then their families will remember, they will remember, and it mushrooms out. The suspect that you don't treat fairly, the witness that you don't treat fairly, you're not only not treating them fairly, but also their families, their friends, everybody who's associated with them, and it comes back to haunt you in the end.
All right. So when it comes to police-community relations, I know a lot of times our main focus seems to be police shootings and acts of violence against people in the community. Are we right to look at it that way, or should we have a different viewpoint?
So when you look at some of the Pew Research, the numbers show us 60% of police officers believe that those shootings are isolated incidents, while 30% of the community believes that that is the representative of a deeper problem. So we're already starting from a very different vantage point, trying to understand what the problem is. And if you see it as an isolated incident, our natural instinct is to dismiss it. So you're on a pattern of dismissals of these incidents because you're saying it doesn't represent anything, just kind of, that was an accident, you know, overlook it. While for the community, it is a consistent process of started with a level of disrespect. For example, when officers go to, if I live in a community where there's a lot of police presence and someone has broken into my home, when law enforcement arrives at the scene, they're automatically engaging me as if I have done something wrong. Are there drugs in the home? Did you do this? Do you know the people? Versus really embracing me as a victim. So the level of disrespect begins at the first encounters that aren't dangerous, that aren't violent, that are not threatening, and it begins to grow then with the stops that no one talks about, with the disrespectful conversations, with the demeaning and dehumanizing way that people start treating each other. Then it elevates to the encounters, and those encounters behind it has a lot of the memories and the pain and all of the angst that goes towards that. Then that encounter has a firearm that is withdrawn, and then the firearm is discharged, and you have a dead person who had been mistreated the entire time. So on and on and on, you have a pattern of conduct that for the community, they are seeing this constantly, and they are saying, listen, I need to know this is consistent with how I've been treated since I lived here. And the police officers who aren't in that community policing, who may be blind to it because they may be policing the tourist district, for example, in Orlando, or they may be the higher echelon, they're not recognizing that this is a pattern of conduct, so they say this is just an isolated incident, and they begin to dismiss it. That is the starting point of dissension, in my opinion, between the police and the communities, is how we perceive this. The framing of the issue determines how we ultimately answer the question.
Well, part of the thing that we're missing out on with these isolated incidents, as we like to claim that they are, is that typically there's many, many more incidents that could have turned out that way that didn't, fortunately. And we're missing out on a learning opportunity. If a airplane crashes, we don't say that that's an isolated incident. We get in there and we study all the causes, everything that contributed to that airplane crashing. And we then develop policies and procedures and training in order to prevent it from happening again. Typically in law enforcement, we close ranks for a lot of reasons. One is liability issues. We're concerned about liability. And as a result, once everything's resolved, we haven't learned anything, we haven't studied the problem, and so we have no solutions whatsoever. I will say that's one thing that the National Institute of Justice is trying to promote, that law enforcement embrace reviews of what they call Sentinel Events. A shooting is a Sentinel event. It means that there's something that happened that points to a bigger problem within the organization. By reviewing everything that contributed to it, you're able to learn from it, teach others, and all that, but we're not doing that. And that's really where we're missing out on helping the community understand what happened and also preventing it from happening again.
I think one of the things that is interesting here in terms of what Aramis was saying about the perception, and the perception coming from police officers or police departments in general, the perception coming from communities about what is actually happening. And one of the things that I think police officers need is a significant education about the history of policing in this country, so that they understand when they walk into this community what people are seeing. As a police officer, I may think I'm walking in with a badge on my chest and a gun on my hip and I'm here to do good, and they don't understand that what the people in that community are seeing is that badge and that gun and what that has represented for decades before these officers were even thinking about being police officers. They do not walk into communities with an open book. There is a history there. You've talked about, both of you have talked about the way police officers deal in communities. The Milwaukee Police Department had a procedure which they called the train. They would send 7 cars into a neighborhood to make a quote-unquote felony arrest, license or sirens and lights going. They go into the house with SWAT teams. They pull people out. They throw them on the ground. They kneel in their back. They're screaming at them to stop resisting, put your hands behind your back. And I will say, I don't know how many of you have ever been thrown on the ground and had somebody kneel in your back. I guarantee you your body will react to that. And so the concept stop resisting is, well, if you would get your knee out of my back, maybe the pain that you're causing me would make me, would stop, and I would stop frisking around so much. These police officers come into the community and they make these kind of arrests, and then 2 days later, when they come in looking for witnesses to a homicide, they're saying, these people just don't care. They're not here to help us when we're here to help them. And it's like, don't you remember the personality and the part of yourself that you showed when you came into this community the last time? So I think a reckoning is necessary for police in America to understand there is a reason why there is a lack of trust in the black community, and it's not that we're making shit up or that we're too sensitive.
Well, in my own experience, I mean, I came from a white community. I didn't have a lot of contact with the African American people when I was growing up. My perception of a police officer was what I saw on Adam 12. I did have more experience before I became a police officer, as I was a paramedic for many years and all of that. But still, I had no idea of the history, what you were talking about, during most of my career. And so that was a wall. But it's so funny. A lot of what law enforcement does is it likes to create the perception that we're doing something. And I remember when the Holocaust Museum first opened up in D.C., my chief had all of us go and take a special tour just so that we could understand how in Germany the police helped to facilitate the Holocaust. I've never had anything like that for this country here. And I think that is an excellent idea and would really, really go a long way of sensitizing the officer to what they're walking into in some of these communities. Because I've been on both sides where I've actually been part of the tactical units, but then I've had to go back and try to gain the cooperation of somebody in critical investigations, and just having that wall there that it would take forever to get past.
And that is, if I may, just for a moment, that is one of the most important parts of that I've added to my office is a level of community engagement, because we often look at crime as if it's cross-cultural when the numbers show us that it is not. Black-on-black crime is a crazy concept because most white-on-white crime is the same thing. Like, you don't have a lot of cross-cultural crime according to the research.
Because we're in a segregated country.
Hello, so when it comes to having to prosecute or complete an investigation, you actually need that same community who has been marginalized, neglected, mistreated. You need them. So it's important for us to engage our communities in ways that we didn't historically when we're dealing with some of these root issues, so that we understand that there's an ongoing relationship, and I'm not just using you, but I'm also helping to serve you. We forget to use the concept of service. That is what prosecutors do. That is what law enforcement does. And then the flip side of it is one thing that we haven't touched on, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but one of the things that we keep forgetting is there has to be an understanding and a weighing of it, right? A lot of times we have the conversations, and I'm adamant. I mean, I have been stopped. I understand the concept. I get it. I mean, I grew up black, right? I've been black my whole life, so I understand what it's like. The flip side of it, though, is that when you go on a ride with police, you have to understand that they do face some dangers. And unfortunately, that is frequently used as a hold card to slap it down on the table when it's convenient. And if we can get away from the convenient arguments that help us prove our point, and we can have candid discussions about the fears that we both have on both sides, I think that moves us towards a more productive engagement, encounter, and safety for everyone. Because where we are right now, it's not that it's just not safe for police, and it's not that it's not safe for black and brown communities. We also leave out poor communities who are included in this conversation as well. It's not safe for anyone.
Yeah, and I get that part, because for me it seems that's frustrating, because I've been on the side where, you know, you're pulled over and it's almost like you have to go by a manual whenever you're being pulled over. But there's some times where you're being pulled over and you know it's for the wrong reason. So I'll give you an example. So my first year in the NFL, after my first season, I came back home and I shipped my car back home. It was a Mercedes-Benz at the time. And where I'm from, you don't usually see Mercedes-Benz. So I'm riding and the cop was actually in front of me. And I'm riding behind him. Obviously, I'm not speeding because I'm trailing him. And I'm trailing him at a decent space. For some reason, he looks in the rear view. He sees this car. He pulls over to the side. I continue going. He pulls right behind me. and then puts his lights on. And I knew immediately once he pulled over, here we go. I knew I was getting pulled over. And he pulls behind me, puts his lights on, I pull to the side. And he comes up to my car, and in my head, I'm like, you stopping me because you want to know who's driving this car. Like, I already know why you're stopping me. And as a human being, you're ticked off because you have no reason for stopping me. So he stops me and he gives me, do you know how close you should be trailing a car? And like, I wanted to get slick and be like, I have my driver's license. Like, I passed the test. So of course I know. But I'm like, yes. And then he asks me the real question, like, whose car is this? And I'm like, it's my car. What do you mean? License and registrations. So I give it to him, and then he goes back, he checks it, and then I guess he realizes who I am. Oh, Mr. Boldin, I'm so sorry, da-da. And I'm like, are you serious? But like, for me, like, I know why you're pulling me over. And like, I know my rights, obviously, but like, for us, it feels like we have to have some type of restraint. Even though we can be violated at times, we still have to have some kind of restraint. When too often, officers never have to show that type of restraint.
What
they're
you
the
just said
professionals.
is they're the professionals. And in those kind of situations, what is put onto us is the responsibility to de-escalate. I am 62 years old, and I have gone home where I am cursing, practically punching the wall because a 25-year-old police officer, somebody that's young enough to be my grandson, has pulled me over with his hand on his gun, and I am saying, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, officer, may I do this? Because I don't want to get hurt. And I'm thinking, why do I have to treat this young man this way when he should be treating me with a little bit of respect? But it's because of the situation that Aramis has talked about, that our ex-police officer has talked about in terms of the culture of policing. And culture trumps training. You can train officers to not have stops like that. You can train officers not to do this, not to do that. But when they leave the academy, if they get into a car with a senior officer who says, forget that stuff they taught you at the academy, that's going to get you killed.
Each and every time.
This is the way you do it. Training is always trumped by culture. And so when you have, and let me be clear, there are leaders in police departments around the country who are trying to turn this around. You can see a video online of the Camden, New Jersey Police Department confronting a black man who has an 8-inch butcher knife, who has been swinging it at people, not just holding it. And they come in, he is clearly out of control, and what do? They walk with him for 10 minutes. They clear the street in front of him so nobody's going to get hurt. And the officers following him are not saying, hey, scumbag, drop the knife. They're saying, sir, please put down the knife. Sir, put down the knife. They're clearing so nobody is going to get hurt. They're saying to themselves, if we tase him, he has a jacket on, it may not work. Other officers not in the Camden Police Department have also responded. You can see on the videotape, they are pulling their guns, and the Camden cops are saying, don't do that. We've got this. They walk with this guy for 10 minutes, and one of the times he was swinging the knife, he dropped it, and they jumped on him. And there was a police dog there as well. The dog didn't bite him. The man had a boo-boo right here on his chin because he scraped it when he fell. He was not a felon. He was a man who was off his medication. He went home, the cops went home, nobody got hurt, nobody got killed, and those officers were promoted in the Camden Police Department because they didn't shoot that man. And so if you're going to start promoting officers for not shooting someone, for treating people with respect and not treating them with disrespect, for going the extra mile to de-escalate a situation, if you are going to change a culture, you've got to start rewarding the behaviors that you want to see.
All right, so Aramis, let me ask you this question, because I know that prosecutors play a huge role in this when it comes to holding police accountable. And I know in the black community, a lot of times it's frustrating. Unfortunately, my family just went through this for like the last 3.5 years. My cousin was killed by an officer, plainclothes officer, and only thing he did was break down on the side of the road. And while on the phone with roadside assistance, he was killed by a police officer. And the officer was just convicted. And I was happy, elated that the officer was convicted and he was held accountable. But he was the first officer in 30 years to be convicted in regards to an on-duty shooting. And I know he isn't the first officer that was in the wrong when it comes to killing of a civilian. I was happy that he was convicted, but the first thing I thought about when I heard that he was the first officer convicted in 30 years was how many other families didn't get the justice that my family got. And not only get the justice, but there's a lot of families that don't even get their day in court. So how do you, as a prosecutor, go about holding these guys accountable?
So that's a whole nother panel, right? But it's a good question because it's real. And the real question is, are we recognizing the impact and what that does each time we either convict or we acquit that conduct? Because while you're thinking how it impacts you, which you should be, personally, your family, the right to be in court, I think on the other side, how empowered prosecutors feel that we are able to do the right thing under the circumstances with or without a uniform. I think of the chilling message that can be sent to departments to be mindful how you interact. So the level of justice is not just limited to the people who are directly impacted. It is that pebble in the water that begins to permeate all the way and impact everyone. So what has happened in your situation, that there's that level of justice, but inside you're still hurting because you know that it didn't reach the highest places. You know that it's still being other people are still being shot and killed, and the message that was sent to your family is a secret, right? You know, like it's just, well, it kind of happened, and then it doesn't begin to impact us exponentially as it should. There are dead people over this, and we have lost sight of humanity. We've lost sight of the real impact of what is happening because we're protecting safety or because people are doing their job. There are dead people. There are human beings, there are families that are hurting, and the minute that we begin to dismiss this, we have dismissed our own brethren. We have dismissed the loss of life. So when we start talking about it, this is why this dialogue is so important. It's not necessarily because they're shooting, it's because people are laying dead in the middle of the road, and if we don't care about a dead body, then what do we care about? So I think that we have to not just look at, you know, how we do it as prosecutors. That's part of the process, but the real conversation is what message is being sent. And I can look at families and I look at you. I am so sorry. Like, no one should have to deal with that. I'm broken down, I'm hurting, I need help, and I get killed. And that is the conversation that I think we never get to, and I am so grateful for the work that you do and that you all do in order to open up this conversation. We can't end it in a day. And I think when it goes back to some of the stuff that he talked about earlier, discussing the root causes of it, until we recognize and admit this didn't happen in one day. It didn't happen in 10 years. It's not going to be fixed in one day. We have to chip away at it. We have to chip away at it, and then ultimately, hopefully, there will be less bodies laying in the middle of the road.
You got a conviction. Did that police department ever acknowledge that what happened was wrong?
And that's part of it. That's part of it. Because here I am. Prior to that, I was working with the sheriff's department, right? And I've had my charity. I started it my first year while I was in the NFL. So my charity has been around for about 17 years. We serve underprivileged kids here in Florida, everywhere I've played, California, San Francisco, Baltimore, Arizona. So my foundation has been very active in the communities that I've been in, where I come from. I do a mentoring program every Wednesday out in the Glades. I'm from Pahokee. So like I'm very involved in my community. I do what we call Q Fest, and it's a week-long celebration of the community. So I always felt it was important to allow the kids who come from where I come from see their idols. So I would invite 30 NFL guys. We would do celebrity golf. We would do fun day in the park. We would do celebrity basketball games. But I would allow them to be in my community and just interact with the kids and stuff. And I would always have police officers out. Great. A lot of the police officers that I was dealing with, when this happens, I'm in the courtroom and they're supporting this guy.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's the whole, one of the things that other high-risk the occupations have discovered from doing these reviews that I'm talking about, where you actually find the root cause of all the problems, is the power of an apology, of the power of admitting that you are wrong. And that's what we're really lacking in law enforcement. We don't want to admit that we're wrong. We don't want to admit that we make a mistake. We want to be, the Superman all the time. And we need to be able to bite the bullet and admit honestly that what happened to you, what happened to your family was wrong. This is why it happened. We're taking steps now to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And until we start doing that, one, these situations will keep occurring, and two, you and others like you will have unnecessary pain that you're going through because nothing's changed.
There is the end of one of the best Western movies in American history, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And at the end of this movie, the man who has made his entire political career on the theory that he shot and killed this evil man, Liberty Valance, he admits that he didn't do it. He didn't kill the guy. And the newspaper reporter who is listening to this story tears up his notes and throws them into the fire, and he says, "This is the West, sir. When the legend meets fact, print the legend." And that is the problem that America has had with policing throughout our entire history of our country. We want to portray the police as the officer I befriendly, the officer that you can trust, officers who are here to help the community. And we have ignored the fact that, despite the fact that there are many police officers who want to be that officer and who are that officer, this is not an isolated problem. There are police officers on forces in the United States who are in white supremacist groups. There are police officers who have been disciplined time and time again, and then they go to another force. The officer that killed Tamir Rice in Cleveland is now employed by a different police agency. And so the unwillingness to have that moment, the thing that William Burroughs in his book Naked Lunch called that moment when everyone has to look at what is really on the end of their fork. Our refusal to have that look in the mirror at what policing in America has become is at the root cause of changing this dynamic. Those officers who shook your hand, who I'm sure were absolutely genuine when they were expressing friendship or collaboration with you, and then this thing happens in your family and all of a sudden you're the other because you're asking that they be held accountable. Every politician in America has run on a theory of accountability. Every parent in America would be horrified at the concept, if your child does something wrong, just pat them on the head and say, "That's no problem, just keep doing that." We all talk about accountability until it comes to our police. Holding our police accountable is not disrespecting police. It's not saying that they don't have a difficult job. But if we give you the authority to come into people's homes against their will, to pull a gun on them and to require them to behave in a certain way, and if they don't, you can use deadly force against them, if we give somebody that authority, then you better be prepared to be held accountable if you misuse that authority. I don't see that that's an issue.
You know, Jeff, I think that we also have to acknowledge, when we're talking about roots, the history of this country, it's about money. You know, everything the decisions are made about money, and that's relevant in this conversation because the reason people don't admit they're wrong is because they get sued, and it makes them lose money. It's an entire process. If I admit I shouldn't have killed that person, the next thing that happens is there's a lawsuit.
You have just put your finger on it. In the last 3 years, the 4 largest police departments in America have paid more than $1 billion in police misconduct cases. How can you pay that much money and not have officers being convicted of crimes? And so you are right. When the officers are looking at you and thinking, man, I feel really bad about what happened to your cousin, but they know if I say something like, hey, it shouldn't have happened, I may end up in a deposition somewhere. My department may be held accountable. So I can't do that. I've got to defend our department.
Well, not only do they feel like they have to defend it for that reason, but also, you know, cops have a lot of physical courage. I mean, it does take courage to go out there and do some of the stuff, or face some of the things that they have to do. And they get acknowledged for that. What is not acknowledged, in fact, what is extremely hard is that moral courage, to be able to go against the status quo, to be able to stand up and say, this is wrong. Because where physical courage takes a matter of seconds, you know, it's there, you do it, it's over with. That moral courage, it's a much more long-term process where you're badgered by your coworkers, you're ostracized, you may not get that promotion or that transfer that you want because you're not a team player. And so there's that wall there that it would take an awful lot of courage for that officer to walk across that aisle and tell you this was wrong. And there's some that want to do it, and I fault those who don't, but I also acknowledge that it's a lot harder to do that than, like I said, that physical courage thing, and they are definitely punished for it.
So let me ask you this, because I'm glad you brought that up, because my question is, how do we protect those officers that are willing to stand up to the status quo? Because I've had officers who've acknowledged that not only was that officer wrong, but the department was wrong. But I think a lot of times, like you said, if they speak too loudly about that, they'll be ostracized, a lot of times demoted. A lot of them won't even feel comfortable going back to that department and working in that same force if they speak out against the wrongs of that department. So how do we protect them and ensure that they can speak out?
Part of that's upper management, which is a major sell right there, because remember, upper management.
So what if you're speaking out against upper management?
I'm sorry?
What if you're speaking out against upper management?
You're screwed. No, but I mean, that's where people like prosecutors, like your politicians and all, have to try to put in some kind of protections. But also, I've done a lot of innocence work, and actually doing innocence work when I worked on my department got me in a lot of trouble. But one of the things that I've been trying to promote is I get calls every so often about TV shows about cold cases. And I keep trying to plug these producers, telling them, look, you need to do shows about cops who go out and stand up and help to overturn wrongful convictions, because that way you encourage that sort of activity. Making it, trying to get some system to reward these people for doing that. And I tell you the truth, I don't think I have an answer for it.
Well, it's culture change, and that is the most difficult thing to accomplish. It has to start with people in leadership. So if you have a chief of police that's telling his officers, if you pull your gun and point it at somebody, you're going to be in my office telling me why you did that. And if it's not a good enough reason, there's going to be consequences for that. You have to have people in Aramis's job who are willing to say, if this information comes to my office and I think you've done a bad shooting, your ass is getting prosecuted, whether there's a conviction or not.
The thing we're not talking about, though, are police unions.
Oh, my
Like,
God, yeah. Police.
That's a whole nother issue and a layer of protection that guards them. If I get in line with the chief of police that we're not going to do this, we create MOUs and we're moving forward, and then they're no longer they're on our Brady list. We're not calling them. They lose their job. Then the minute they get back, the police union president is looking at the chief like, "Huh, you see your new guy?" You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
And they understand that. So the legislation that allows police unions to have the power is a bigger issue than the actual police departments and those who head it up.
I find it interesting that politicians are always seeking out the support of the local police union because they think it makes them look like they're law and order.
Not all of them.
Oh, not okay. Granted. However, you have to remember as voters that the police union is not looking out for you. It's not looking out for your neighborhoods or your community. They're looking out for the welfare of the officers. In D.C., we had a very progressive city council member who was pushing for mandatory videotaping of interrogations. She was extremely supportive of good investigations, but she was hard on cops who didn't do their job. The union went against her hard, and I think that was part of the reason that she lost. But this union also represented 90% of its members lived outside the city, and in my opinion, they had no business in this fight whatsoever. But yeah, when a union supports a politician, think twice about that being a reason to vote for them.
I think we have a question from Adelia Thomas.
Okay. Jim, how do you take the blue line, approach the blue line officers and get them to see that this is an important issue to address?
That's not good. I think we need to come up with a way, and I mentioned this before, and I have no idea how to do it in the long run, of rewarding the positive behavior. Part of it is going to be changing the way that we judge ourselves and we judge officers, such as, like I said, the number of arrests that you make, the number of tickets that you write, things along that line. Because there's so many things in law enforcement that you cannot put a number to, but are critical when it comes to building strong ties with the community and things like that. It's going to take, like we were talking about, there's a few progressive chiefs out there that are really supporting these new innovations and these new approaches. But just like on what you were talking about with that department, another department actually fired an officer because he didn't shoot somebody.
An officer in South Carolina that the ACLU actually represented, and he won reinstatement of his job, although he didn't take it. He took some money and he left, but he was literally fired because he responded to a domestic violence event, and the woman who had called said, "He's in the yard, he has a gun, it's unloaded, I think he's trying to kill himself, please be careful." And when the officer pulled up, he looked at the guy in the eye and he said, "Brother, I'm not going to kill you tonight." 2 minutes later, 2 other officers arrived and they shot him dead. I think that what you're talking about in terms of moving that blue line, it is very difficult. My view is that what is required is a reckoning. It is going to be impossible to get people to change their behavior in the short term or the long term without them understanding the history that's been behind it. I believe that for people of good faith, police officers of good faith, if they understood the way that this country has asked police forces to control black and brown communities with violence, if they understood that history, if they understood what people are seeing when they walk into those communities, things would start to change. We are talking about changing a culture that is literally hundreds of years old. This is not going to happen overnight. But the only way it will happen is for these incidents to be brought to the public, for people to continue to see them. People are saying, do we have to keep seeing these videos? They're so difficult. And I understand that. But I will remind people that the civil rights movement in the mid-50s was literally kickstarted when Emmett Till's mother decided, I am not going to let my pain at losing my son take away from the importance of this moment. And she had Jet magazine come into that funeral parlor and take pictures of what they did to her son. And they put those pictures all over the national media. And I believe that in the 50s, when that picture got published, many white Americans had this reaction. I know those colored people down there are causing problems, but I didn't sign up for this. And I think the more we can make people in America look at the reality of what is happening with policing, people of good faith will come to a point where they have to make a decision. And if we try for solutions that don't deal with that, we're going to be taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward.
But you know, one of the biggest problems that's out there is that we have like 18,000 different police departments here in this country. That's 18,000 different kingdoms with 18,000 different kings and queens that want their things done their way. So when it comes to reform, and like there's really no national standard. There's no hiring standard. There's no training standard. Like with other professions that may have national board certification and training requirements, we don't have any of that in law enforcement. So that's something that really needs to be.
Well, let me just make one plug about that. In the next several months, the ACLU will be coming out with a 21st century policing document. This is a document that has been vetted by people all across the country, police professionals, community leaders, trying to come up with, it's easy to tell police, don't do this, don't do that. But what has been lacking is an affirmative vision of what do we want our police to do. And that's part of what the ACLU is going to try and foment discussion with this document that will be coming out in the next several months. And we hope that it will be a vehicle for both police officers and community members to start talking about what we actually want our police officers to do.